The Montana sun beat down mercilessly on James Morrison's weathered hands as he knelt beside his withered cornstalks, the dry earth cracking beneath his knees like broken promises. 3 months without proper rain had turned his once promising homestead into a monument to futility. The irrigation ditches he'd dug with such hope the previous spring now held nothing but dust and the occasional tumbling weed. "Damn this godforsaken land," he muttered, pulling his worn hat lower to shield his eyes from the glare. At 32, James had the hands of a man twice his age, scarred by barbed wire, roughened by endless labor, and now trembling slightly from the constant worry that gnawed at his gut. The letter from the bank sat folded in his shirt pocket, the paper soft from repeated handling. 2 months behind on his mortgage payments, with harvest season yielding nothing but dust and disappointment. Mr. Henderson at First National had been clear during their last meeting. "Come autumn, Morrison, you either pay up or pack up." James stood slowly, his knees protesting after hours of examining his failed crops. His small cabin squatted in the distance, its single window reflecting the harsh afternoon light like an accusing eye. Sarah's photograph sat on the mantelpiece inside, his wife of 4 years, taken by consumption the previous winter. Without her steady hand, managing their meager finances and tending the vegetable garden that had kept them fed, James felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting towards certain disaster. The sound of his horse whinnying drew his attention to the corral, where Buck, his faithful bay gelding, stood with his head hanging low. Even the animal seemed to sense the desperation that hung over the Morrison homestead like smoke from a distant fire. "I know, boy," James called to the horse. "We're all feeling it." He walked to the well, hoping against hope that the water level might have risen overnight. The wooden bucket disappeared into the darkness below, and when he hauled it up, barely 2 inches of muddy water sloshed in the bottom. Soon, even that would be gone. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that mocked the barren landscape below, James made his decision. Tomorrow he would ride to Copper Creek for supplies, maybe his last trip as a landowner. Maybe Charlie at the general store would extend him credit one more time, though James knew his chances were slimmer than morning frost in July. Inside the cabin, he sat at his rough-hewn table and opened his leather-bound journal, a wedding gift from Sarah. The entries had grown shorter and more desperate over the month since her death. July 15th, 1885. Corn is lost. Maybe 10% salvageable. Water nearly gone. Must go to town tomorrow. God help me, I don't know what else to do. He closed the journal and stared at Sarah's photograph. Her gentle smile seemed to offer comfort, even in death. But tonight, it only deepened his sense of failure. He'd promised to build something lasting on this land, to create the family and home they'd dreamed of during their courtship back in Ohio. Instead, he was about to lose everything to the harsh realities of frontier life. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's single window and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness James felt growing inside his chest. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight he could only sit with his ghosts and pray for a miracle he no longer believed would come. The morning sun was still a pale promise on the eastern horizon when James saddled Buck for the 15-mile ride to Copper Creek. The horse's ribs showed more prominently than they had a month ago, another reminder of their dwindling resources. James had given Buck the last of the oats the previous evening, keeping only a handful of jerky and hardtack for himself. "Sorry, old friend," he whispered, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Once we get to town, I'll see about getting you some proper feed." The trail to Copper Creek wound through a landscape that seemed carved from desperation itself. Sagebrush and scattered pine trees dotted the rolling hills, interrupted by dry creek beds that hadn't seen running water since the spring melt. James had ridden this path dozens of times over the past 3 years, but today it felt different, like he was saying goodbye to a life that was already slipping away. 3 hours into the journey, as they crested a ridge overlooking Willow Creek Canyon, Buck suddenly stopped and pricked his ears forward. The horse's body tensed beneath James, and he followed the animal's gaze down into the canyon, where a thin line of cottonwoods marked the presence of water. At first James saw nothing unusual. Then Buck whinnied softly, and an answering sound drifted up from the canyon floor. Not another horse, but something else. Something that made James's blood run cold. It was the cry of a human infant. What in the hell? James dismounted quickly, his boots sliding on the loose shale as he led Buck down the steep canyon wall. The crying grew louder as they descended, desperate and raw with the sound of genuine distress. Near a small seep spring where water barely trickled from between the rocks, James found the source of the cries. A tiny bundle wrapped in what appeared to be deer hide lay beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood tree. As he approached, the crying intensified, and James could see small brown fists waving weakly in the air. "Jesus," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside the bundle. It was a baby, Native American by the look of the child's features and the traditional wrappings. Couldn't be more than a few months old, with thick black hair and dark eyes that seemed far too large for the tiny face. The infant's lips were cracked and dry, and the crying had taken on a hoarse quality that spoke of hours, maybe days, of distress. James looked around quickly, expecting to see signs of a camp or other people, but the canyon was empty except for the wind in the cottonwoods and the barely audible trickle of the spring. No footprints in the sand, no horse tracks, nothing to indicate how this child had come to be alone in the wilderness. "Where's your mama, little one?" James asked softly, gently lifting the bundle. The baby weighed almost nothing, and James could feel the sharp angles of ribs beneath the soft wrappings. The child was dying. That much was clear. Dehydration, starvation, exposure, any one of which would be fatal without immediate care. James's mind raced through possibilities. The nearest town was still 12 miles away, and he had no way to feed an infant, even if they made it that far. But he also knew he couldn't leave this child to die. Working quickly, James dampened his neckerchief in the spring water and carefully dripped moisture onto the baby's lips. The infant's tongue darted out desperately, and James repeated the process, watching as some color returned to the tiny face. "Easy now," he murmured, the same tone he used to calm skittish horses. "We're going to figure this out." As he worked, James noticed details about the child's wrappings, intricate beadwork in patterns he didn't recognize, but clearly Native American craftsmanship. The baby wore a small leather pouch around its neck, decorated with what looked like crow feathers and colored stones. Crow tribe, most likely. But what was a Crow infant doing this far south in territory that was more traditionally Blackfoot? And why had the child been left alone? The questions would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only priority. James fashioned a makeshift sling from his jacket and secured the baby against his chest, then began the careful climb back up the canyon wall. Buck stood patiently as James mounted, the horse seeming to sense the gravity of their new situation. "Change of plans, Buck," James said quietly, adjusting the baby's position as they started back toward the trail. "We're still going to town, but now we've got a passenger." The infant had stopped crying and seemed to be sleeping. Tiny fingers curled against James's shirt. As they rode through the morning heat, James found himself talking to the child, his voice a low murmur that seemed to provide comfort to both of them. "Don't know what your story is, little one, but I guess we're in this together now. Both of us fighting to survive out here in this hard country." The irony wasn't lost on him. Yesterday, he'd been a failed farmer facing financial ruin. Today, he was a man with a baby who needed saving, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. The dust-covered streets of Copper Creek came into view as James crested the final hill before town, the baby still sleeping fitfully against his chest. The settlement consisted of little more than 24 weathered buildings, clustered around a main street that turned to mud, with the slightest rain and dust, with the gentlest breeze. Today, under the relentless July sun, it was definitely dust. James could feel eyes on him before he even reached the hitching posts outside Charlie's general store. Mrs. Patterson paused in hanging her laundry to stare openly, her mouth forming a small ooh of surprise. Old Pete, who spent most days whittling on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, actually stopped his knife mid-stroke. The baby stirred as Buck's hooves clattered on the hard-packed earth, letting out a small cry that seemed to echo off the false fronts of the buildings like a gunshot. James dismounted carefully, one hand supporting the infant while he secured Buck's reins. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice from behind him. James turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley approaching, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Not threatening exactly, but ready. Bradley was a fair man, James knew, but he was also practical above all else. In a town that survived on the delicate balance between white settlers and the various tribal nations that still considered this their ancestral land, unexpected babies could mean unexpected trouble. "Morning, Sheriff," James said carefully, adjusting the baby's position so Bradley could see the child clearly. Found this little one abandoned down in Willow Creek Canyon. Been crying for who knows how long. Bradley stepped closer, his weathered face creasing as he examined the infant's traditional wrappings and the beaded pouch around its neck. Crow, by the look of it, he said quietly. That's unusual this far south. They mostly keep to the northern ranges these days. Child was near dead when I found him, James continued, using him, though he hadn't actually determined the baby's gender. Gave him some water, but he needs milk and soon. By now a small crowd had gathered on the wooden sidewalk. James recognized most of the faces. Farmers, shopkeepers, the banker Henderson, even Reverend Walsh from the small Methodist church. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to concern, to something that looked uncomfortably like suspicion. You sure you just found this baby, Morrison? The voice belonged to Carl Brennan, who owned the largest spread in the area and had never made any secret of his feelings about the local tribes. Mighty convenient, you showing up with an Indian baby right when you're about to lose your land. James felt heat rise in his face, but before he could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. Carl Brennan, you should be ashamed of yourself. Dr. Martha Coleman pushed through the crowd, her medical bag already in hand. James had met her only once before. She was one of the few female doctors on the frontier, having taken over her late husband's practice 2 years earlier. She was a small woman, barely reaching James's shoulder, but she moved with the kind of authority that made grown men step aside. Let me see the child, she said to James, her tone brooking no argument. James carefully transferred the baby to Dr. Coleman's experienced hands. She unwrapped the deer hide partially, her fingers checking for fever, examining the tiny limbs for signs of injury or disease. Dehydrated, malnourished, but alive, she announced to the crowd. This baby hasn't eaten in at least 2 days, maybe 3. Another few hours and... She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. We should contact the Indian agent, Sheriff Bradley said. Let the government handle this proper. The nearest Indian agent is in Helena, Dr. Coleman replied sharply. That's a 4-day ride. And this baby needs care now, not next week. She looked up at James, her green eyes appraising. You willing to help me save this child's life, Mr. Morrison? James nodded without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Then we need to get to my office. I've got a goat that just had kids. We can try goat's milk, see if the baby can keep it down. She was already moving toward her small clinic at the end of the street. As they walked, the crowd began to disperse, though James could feel their stares and hear the low murmur of conversation that would soon become the talk of the entire town. Carl Brennan's voice carried above the rest. Mark my words, no good's going to come of this. Inside Dr. Coleman's clinic, the atmosphere was blessedly cool and quiet. Medical texts lined one wall, and the smell of carbolic acid and dried herbs filled the air. The doctor worked quickly, preparing a small feeding bottle with warm goat's milk, while James held the baby. You did the right thing, she said, as she tested the milk's temperature on her wrist. Whatever anyone else might say, you saved this child's life. Don't feel much like doing right, James admitted. Feel more like I'm stumbling around in the dark, hoping I don't make things worse. Dr. Coleman smiled for the first time since they'd met. That's called being human, Mr. Morrison. The fact that you're worried about doing right probably means you will. The baby took to the milk immediately, tiny hands grasping at the bottle with desperate hunger. As they watched the infant feed, Dr. Coleman spoke quietly. The beadwork on those wrappings, that's crow, but it's also mourning work. See those black beads mixed with the blue? Someone in this baby's family has died recently. James felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. The mother, most likely, could be why the child was left. If the mother died and there was no one else to care for an infant during a difficult time. She paused, studying the baby's face. This is a little girl, by the way, maybe 4 months old, a daughter. James found himself looking at the tiny face with new eyes, seeing Sarah's gentle features reflected somehow in the dark eyes that were now closing contentedly as the baby fed. What happens now? James asked. Now we keep her alive and see what tomorrow brings, Dr. Coleman replied. But Mr. Morrison, James, you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. This isn't just about saving one baby's life. In this territory, everything between white settlers and the tribes is balanced on a knife's edge. One misunderstanding, one wrong move, and people die. James nodded slowly, but his resolve didn't waver. Doctor, I've got nothing left to lose. My farm's failing, my wife's gone, and I'm 2 months from being homeless myself. If caring for this child brings trouble, well, I reckon I was already in trouble. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, and James knew he had a decision to make. He could ride home alone and let others decide the baby's fate, or he could take responsibility for the tiny life that had literally been placed in his path. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. 3 days later, James sat in his cabin's single chair, gently rocking the baby girl he'd started calling Little Bird, a name that seemed to fit her delicate features and the way she moved her tiny hands like wings when she was content. The goat's milk had worked better than anyone had dared hope, and Dr. Coleman's careful instructions had helped James learn the basics of infant care with surprising speed. The morning routine had become oddly comforting. Prepare the milk, change the cloth diapers Dr. Coleman had provided, walk the floor when Little Bird fussed, and talk to her in the same low, steady voice he used with spooked horses. For the first time since Sarah's death, James had a reason to get up each morning that went beyond mere survival, but the peace of the morning was shattered by the thundering of hooves outside. James carefully placed Little Bird in the makeshift cradle he'd built from an old wooden crate, then moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 20 mounted men approaching fast, dust rising behind them like a war banner. At the head of the group rode Carl Brennan, and behind him came faces James didn't recognize, hard men with rifles across their saddles and the look of trouble in their eyes. They pulled up in his yard with military precision, horses snorting and stamping as the men dismounted. James stepped onto his small porch, his hands deliberately visible and empty, though his rifle leaned against the wall just inside the door. "Morning, Carl," James said evenly. "You're traveling with quite a crowd today." Brennan spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dust before answering. "We got word there might be Crow war parties in the area, Morrison. Funny thing is, the rumors started right after you showed up in town with that baby." One of the strangers, a tall man with a deputy's badge and a face like carved granite, stepped forward. "I'm Deputy Marshal Williams from Helena. We've had reports of raids on homesteads north of here. 3 families dead, livestock stolen, buildings burned." His pale eyes fixed on James. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about Crow movements in this area, would you?" "Only thing I know about Crow is that I found a half-dead baby in a canyon," James replied carefully, "and she's been sleeping and eating in my cabin ever since." "She?" Williams's eyebrows rose. "You keeping this Indian baby like some kind of pet, Morrison?" James felt his temper flare, but kept his voice level. "I'm keeping a child alive, Marshal, same as any Christian man would do." From inside the cabin came the sound of Little Bird beginning to fuss, probably hungry again. The men on horseback shifted restlessly, and James could see hands moving closer to weapons. "Bring the baby out," Williams ordered. "I want to see what we're dealing with." James hesitated. Every instinct told him not to bring Little Bird into the middle of this armed confrontation, but refusing would only make things worse. He went inside and gathered the baby, wrapping her carefully in one of Sarah's old shawls to supplement the deer hide. When he emerged, the sight of the tiny face peeking out from the bundle seemed to take some of the fight out of the assembled men. It was hard to see a threat in something so small and helpless. Williams examined the baby's traditional wrappings and the beaded pouch she still wore. "This beadwork, it's not just Crow. See these patterns here?" He pointed to specific designs. "This is high-ranking Crow. This baby's family has status in the tribe." "What's that mean?" Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Means if this child belongs to a chief's family or a medicine man's line, and the Crow think we took her." Williams let the implication hang in the air. Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced new arrivals. But these riders approached differently, silently, seemingly materializing from the landscape itself. James counted at least a dozen Native American warriors, their horses moving in formation that spoke of military training and deadly purpose. The lead rider was an older man, his braided hair streaked with silver, wearing traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and eagle feathers. His face was impassive, but his dark eyes took in every detail of the scene. The armed white men, James holding the baby, the tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. "Nobody move," Williams whispered, his hand slowly moving toward his sidearm. "Nobody do anything stupid." The native leader raised his hand, and his warriors stopped as one, forming a semicircle that effectively surrounded James's cabin. For a long moment, the two groups faced each other across 20 yards of dusty ground, the only sound the whisper of wind through the sage and the soft crying of the baby in James's arms. Then the leader spoke, his English accented but clear. "I am Running Wolf of the Apsaluk people. We have come for the child." Williams stepped forward carefully. "I'm Deputy Marshal Williams. This baby was found abandoned. We're handling this according to territorial law." Running Wolf's gaze shifted to James, and there was something in those dark eyes that made James feel as if his soul was being weighed. "You are the one who found her?" James nodded. 3 days ago, in Willow Creek Canyon. She was near death. "And you cared for her?" "Yes, sir. Fed her, kept her warm, made sure she was safe." Running Wolf dismounted and walked slowly toward James, his warriors remaining motionless but alert. The white men's hands hovered near their weapons, but Williams raised his hand slightly, signaling them to hold. When Running Wolf was close enough to see Little Bird's face clearly, something changed in his expression. His stern features softened almost imperceptibly, and he spoke a few words in his native language that sounded like a prayer or blessing. "This child," he said to James, "is my granddaughter. Her name is Laughing Water, and she is the daughter of my son who died of the spotted sickness 2 moons ago. Her mother died giving birth to her brother 3 days past." He paused, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. She was placed in the canyon by her mother's sister, who believed the child was cursed to bring death to all who cared for her. The weight of this revelation settled over the assembled men like a blanket. James found himself looking down at Little Bird, at Laughing Water, with new understanding. She hadn't been abandoned callously. She'd been placed in the canyon by someone who loved her, but feared for the safety of the tribe. "But you saved her life," Running Wolf continued, his gaze returning to James. "And in doing so, you have honored both our peoples. The Apsaluke do not forget such debts." Behind him, James could hear Carl Brennan muttering something about Indian trickery, but Williams silenced him with a sharp look. "What happens now?" James asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. His heart was already breaking at the thought of giving up the tiny girl who had become his world over the past 3 days. Running Wolf studied James for a long moment, then looked at his granddaughter, then back at James. "Now," he said, "we talk." The sound of children's laughter carried across the Morrison homestead on the warm September morning of 1888, mixing with the steady rhythm of water flowing through the newly constructed irrigation channels. James paused in his work repairing a fence post to watch 6-year-old Laughing Water race through the cornrows, her dark braids flying behind her as she chased a butterfly with the single-minded determination that had become her trademark. "Ate," she called, using the Crow word for father that had become as natural to James as his own name. "Look how big the corn is." James smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The corn was indeed impressive, the best crop he'd managed since settling on this land 5 years ago. The Crow irrigation techniques Running Wolf's people had taught him had transformed his struggling farm into one of the most productive in the area. "It's beautiful, Little Bird," he called back, using the English translation of the pet name he'd given her that first day. "Almost as tall as you." Laughing Water giggled and ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist. Her dress was a curious blend of 2 worlds, a simple cotton frock like the settler children wore, but decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her heritage. Around her neck, she still wore the small pouch she'd had as an infant, now supplemented by a locket containing a photograph of Sarah that James had given her on her 5th birthday. "Grandfather is coming today," she announced, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mother Singing Dove said they'll be here before the sun reaches the middle of the sky." James nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that always preceded Running Wolf's visits. Over the past 3 years, these gatherings had become regular events. Sometimes the Crow Band would camp near the Morrison homestead for several days, and sometimes James and Laughing Water would spend weeks with the tribe during their seasonal migrations. The arrangement had worked better than anyone had dared hope, though it hadn't been without its challenges. "Help me finish this fence, and then we'll get ready for company," James said, handing Laughing Water a small hammer. She attacked the task with enthusiasm, chattering away in a mixture of English and Apsaluk that had become her natural way of speaking. As they worked, James reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day he'd found a dying baby in Willow Creek Canyon. The most obvious change was prosperity. The The combination of Crow agricultural wisdom and his own stubborn determination had turned his failing homestead into a thriving operation. He'd paid off his debts to the bank within 2 years, and even had money saved for the first time in his adult life. But the deeper changes were in himself and in the community around him. Learning Crow language and customs had opened his mind to different ways of seeing the world. He discovered that many of the savage practices whites feared were actually sophisticated solutions to the challenges of frontier life. Crow knowledge of weather patterns, plant cultivation, and water management had proven invaluable not just to him, but to several neighboring farmers who'd swallowed their pride long enough to ask for advice. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. A small group of riders was approaching from the east, not the direction he expected Running Wolf's band to arrive from. As they drew closer, James recognized Deputy Marshal Williams leading 3 men he didn't know, all wearing the clean clothes and serious expressions of government officials. "Trouble?" Laughing Water asked, picking up on the tension in James's posture. "I don't think so, little bird. But why don't you go inside and help Mrs. Coleman with the cooking?" "Doctor." Martha Coleman had become a regular fixture at these gatherings, serving as an unofficial mediator and documenting the unprecedented cultural exchange for her medical journals. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and Williams dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle recently. "Afternoon, James," the marshal said, tipping his hat. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Just preparing for visitors," James replied carefully. "What brings you out this way, Tom?" Williams gestured to the 3 men with him. "Like you to meet Territorial Governor Preston, Indian Agent Morrison, no relation, I assume, and Mr. Whitman from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington." James felt his stomach tighten. In his experience, when this many government officials showed up unannounced, it rarely meant good news. He shook hands with each man, noting their appraising looks as they took in his property, his obvious prosperity, and the evidence of Crow influence in the construction techniques and decorative elements visible around the homestead. "Mr. Morrison," Governor Preston began, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "we're here to discuss the unusual arrangement you've made with the Crow Nation regarding the child known as Laughing Water." "What about it?" James asked, though he kept his voice neutral. Agent Morrison stepped forward, consulting a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "There have been complaints filed with the territorial government, allegations that you're raising this child outside the proper legal framework, that she's not receiving appropriate education in American customs and language, and that your association with the Crow Band represents a security risk to other settlers in the area." James felt anger flare in his chest, but years of walking between 2 cultures had taught him the value of controlling his initial reactions. "Who filed these complaints?" "That's not really relevant," Whitman said smoothly. "What matters is that we investigate any situation involving the welfare of Native American children under territorial jurisdiction." Before James could respond, the sound of many horses approaching from the west announced the arrival of Running Wolf's band. The government officials turned to watch as nearly 30 Crow riders crested the hill, moving in the orderly formation that had once struck fear into settlers' hearts, but now represented a peaceful visit between family and friends. Running Wolf rode at the head of the group, his bearing as dignified as ever despite his advancing years. Beside him rode Singing Dove, the woman who had become Laughing Water's Crow mother, Running Wolf's daughter-in-law, who had lost her own child to the same epidemic that claimed her husband. Behind them came a mix of warriors, women, children, and elders, all dressed in their finest clothes for what they considered a celebration. "Well," Governor Preston murmured, "this is certainly dramatic timing." The Crow Band arranged themselves in a semicircle around the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping as the riders dismounted. Running Wolf approached the group of officials with the careful dignity of a man who had dealt with government representatives many times before, usually under less pleasant circumstances. "I am Running Wolf of the Apsialuk people," he said formally. "I greet you as friends in the home of my adopted son, James Morrison." Governor Preston stepped forward. "Mr. Running Wolf, I'm Territorial Governor Preston. We're here to discuss the custody arrangement regarding the child you call Laughing Water." "Ah," Running Wolf said, his expression becoming unreadable. "You have concerns about how my granddaughter is being raised. We have a responsibility to ensure all children in the territory receive proper education and upbringing according to American law and custom, Agent Morrison said, his tone suggesting he'd given this speech many times before. At that moment, Laughing Water burst from the cabin, having apparently been watching from the window. She ran first to Running Wolf, speaking rapidly in Apsaluki and receiving a warm embrace, then turned to the government officials with the confident curiosity of a child who had never learned to fear strangers. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said in perfect English, offering a small curtsy that Sarah had taught her from a children's etiquette book. "Welcome to our home. Are you staying for dinner? Mrs. Coleman is making her famous apple pie." The officials exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such polished manners from a child they'd probably assumed was being raised as a savage. "Your English is very good," Governor Preston said, crouching down to her level. "Thank you, sir. Ate, that's my father, James. Taught me to read and write, and Mrs. Coleman helps with my arithmetic. I can also speak Apsaluke, which is the proper name for what you probably call Crow. Would you like to hear?" Without waiting for an answer, she launched into a flowing stream of her native language, her face animated as she described the arriving band members and their relationships to her. "She's explaining who everyone is and how they're related to her," Running Wolf translated with obvious pride. "She has committed our entire family history to memory." Whitman consulted his papers again. "What about religious instruction? Is she receiving proper Christian education?" "I attend church with Ate every Sunday when we're here," Laughing Water replied promptly. "Reverend Walsh says I ask the best questions in Sunday school. And when I'm with the Apsaluki, I learn about the Creator from Grandfather and the other elders. Did you know that many of our stories are very similar to the ones in the Bible?" Doctor. Coleman emerged from the cabin at that moment. Drawn by the voices and the obvious tension in the air, she took in the scene quickly. Government officials with their papers and formal attitudes facing off against a mixed group of settlers and Crow people, with one small girl standing confidently in the middle. "Gentlemen," she said briskly, "I hope you'll join us for lunch. Nothing helps a conversation like a good meal." "Actually, Doctor Coleman," Governor Preston said, "we'd like to speak with you as well. You've been documenting this arrangement, haven't you?" "I have indeed. 3 years of detailed observations, medical records, and educational assessments." She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated this moment. "Would you like to see them?" Over the next hour, an impromptu hearing took place on James Morrison's front porch. Dr. Coleman presented 3 years' worth of meticulous documentation showing Laughing Water's physical health, emotional development, and educational progress. The child herself demonstrated her abilities in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history, switching effortlessly between English and Apsaluki depending on the subject matter. Running Wolf spoke eloquently about the benefits his people had gained from their association with James. Not just the successful resolution of the initial crisis, but ongoing cooperation in trade, information sharing about weather and game movements, and peaceful coexistence that had prevented conflicts throughout the region. James testified about how Crow agricultural techniques had transformed not just his farm, but several others in the area, and how the cultural exchange had enriched his own understanding of the land and its possibilities. But perhaps the most compelling testimony came from an unexpected source. Carl Brennan rode up just as the informal hearing was reaching its conclusion, his face grim, but his posture suggesting he had something important to say. "Governor," he said without preamble, "I hear you're questioning James Morrison's fitness to raise that little girl." "Mr. Brennan, isn't it?" Preston replied. "I understand you've had concerns about this arrangement from the beginning." "That's right, I have, but I've also had 3 years to watch how it's worked out." Brennan dismounted and approached the group, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim. "Last spring, when my youngest boy came down with pneumonia, it was Dr. Coleman and Singing Dove working together who saved his life. When the grasshoppers threatened to destroy everyone's crops 2 summers ago, it was Running Wolf's people who taught us how to protect our fields." He paused, looking directly at Laughing Water. "And when my wife was feeling poorly last winter, it was this little girl who rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor, then stayed to help tend the sick until the crisis passed. She's got more courage and sense than most grown folks I know." Brennan turned back to the officials. "I may not understand all the details of how this arrangement works, but I know what I've seen. This territory is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more secure because of what James Morrison started when he saved that baby's life. You government folks want to break that up. You'll be making a mistake that'll cost lives." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the homestead, Governor Preston finally spoke his conclusion. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Running Wolf, this situation is unprecedented. Frankly, there's no legal framework for what you've created here, but the evidence suggests it's working remarkably well, not just for the child in question, but for the broader community." He looked around at the mixed group of settlers and Crow people who had gathered to hear his decision. "I'm prepared to recommend to the territorial legislature that this arrangement be formalized and used as a model for similar situations in the future, but there will be conditions." James felt his heart pounding as he waited for the conditions that could make or break everything they'd built. First, the child must continue to receive formal education according to territorial standards. Second, regular reports must be filed with the Indian Agency documenting her welfare and development. And third, this arrangement will be reviewed annually to ensure it continues to serve the child's best interests. "And if we agree to these conditions," Running Wolf asked, "then Laughing Water Morrison, I believe that would be her legal name, will remain in the joint custody of both her adoptive father and her biological grandfather, with full recognition of her rights as both a territorial citizen and a member of the Crow Nation." Laughing Water looked up at James, then at Running Wolf, then back at the governor. "Does this mean I get to keep both my families?" "Yes, child," Preston replied, with the first genuine smile he'd shown all day. "It means you get to keep both your families." As the officials prepared to leave, and the Crow band settled in for their planned visit, James found himself standing at the edge of his property, looking out over the irrigated fields that represented so much more than agricultural success. Laughing Water ran up to join him, slipping her small hand into his larger one. "Ate, what does it mean that I'm going to be a model?" James chuckled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "It means that other children like you, children who belong to two worlds, might get the same chance you've had to learn from both." "That's good," she said solemnly. "Everyone should have as many families as possible." In the distance, the sounds of the evening camp drifted across the prairie. Children playing, adults talking, the soft nickering of horses and the eternal whisper of wind through grass. It was the sound of two worlds learning to live as one, and it was the most beautiful music James Morrison had ever heard. The letter from the bank that had once threatened to destroy his life now served as a bookmark in Laughing Water's reader. The failing farm had become a symbol of successful cooperation between cultures, and the dying baby he'd found in a canyon had grown into a bridge between worlds that no government official or territorial law could adequately define, but everyone could recognize as something precious and worth protecting. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, James realized that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a quest for something lost, but with the simple decision to save something found.